According to historians, the attempts to establish a tribunal of the Holy Inquisition in Buenos Aires were rejected by the Suprema. However, we know that in the Historical Assembly of the year 13, a document was signed decreeing the termination of the Inquisition in the city. That seems to be the only bit of evidence against the version of the chroniclers, but for the people of La Boca neighborhood, there was once more. Around 30 years ago, I graduated from the seminary at Uribe Larrea. I was assigned to a little chapel in La Boca whose former priest had recently passed away. Right across from the chapel there was a vacant plot of land, the sole remnant of what had once been a square. Just like every other new neighbor in the area, I phoned the local fire department on the night of my arrival to report a fire on those grounds. The operator who received my call burst into laughter. His attitude infuriated me, and I asked him if he was laughing at me. He tried to explain why he was amused, but I wouldn't listen. I just told him to do his job and hung up. A couple of minutes later, the fire engine arrived with its sirens off. I came out and saw that the fire had already burnt out. One of the firefighters, the one in fact who had picked up my call and become the recipient of my anger, crossed the street and over some mates told me the following story. In the times of the Inquisition in Buenos Aires, the neighborhood of La Boca was almost uninhabited. A group of no more than 10 families of Italian origin constituted the whole of its population. That small community, however, would witness an event of extraordinary proportions. Antonella Armentano, a 15-year-old teenager, confessed one night to her parents, facing the impossibility of hiding it any longer, that she was pregnant. Rosario Armentano, her father, walked the neighborhood that night, going door to door, dragging Antonella in search for the baby's father. Salvador Armentano, his own 17-year-old nephew, was the subject of a particularly harsh interrogation. But given that Salvador would not confess and that Antonella kept insisting that she had never been touched by a man, Rosario returned home enraged. But he did not give up. He was determined to take the baby's father to the altar at any cost. During the following week, Antonella had to put up with endless physical violence coming from her father, psychological violence coming from her mother, who alternated long periods of silence with short, hurtful outbursts, and several traps disguised as confidence coming from her sisters. But Antonella stuck to her version. Armentano began to fear that his daughter could be telling the truth. He thought that the tribunal of the Holy Inquisition in Buenos Aires, which had that far sentenced anyone to a penance harsher than praying and fasting, could have the answer. The young girl was taken before the inquisitors, who listened to the story in a state of bewilderment. They were immediately reminded of the prophecy which announced the arrival of the Antichrist in the womb of a virgin, mocking the Messiah as he is known to do. They decided then that they must have an answer at any cost. The inquisitors did not allow the state of the girl to tempt them into feeling any pity, and as soon as they were given the first unsatisfactory answer, they proceeded to torture her. When the girl stuck to her story, a nun was appointed to inspect her body and pronounce a verdict. Once the humiliating test had concluded, the nun testified under oath that Antonella was telling the truth. Unsure of the way the community would react, the inquisitors chose to refer the case to a higher tribunal. So José Calahorra, highest member of the local Inquisition, sent a letter explaining the case in detail to the Lima tribunal. During the long wait for a reply, Antonella spent her days in a dark and wet dungeon. The reply wouldn't come for 3 months. At that point, Antonella was about to give birth. But that would never happen. The decision of the foreign inquisitors was the one the local tribunal had avoided to make. The girl was to be burnt at the stake. She was taken back to La Boca, and in a square naturally carved by the seasonal floods, amidst the screams and tears of her relatives and neighbors, she was burnt alive. Ever since that day, hundreds of people would witness the igneous apparition I had just seen myself. The story had a huge impact on me, and I found it impossible to go to sleep that night until my mind had reached a couple of conclusions. One, the creature in Antonella's womb was not the Antichrist. Maybe Salvador Armentano was the father, maybe some other neighbor. Whoever it was, he had chosen to save his own freedom rather than the lives of Antonella and their baby. The nun in charge of inspecting Antonella's body had almost certainly not done so. It is likely that in her mind any pregnant single woman deserved to die at the stake. And two, an injustice had been done, and because of that a soul, or maybe two, was suffering. Just like almost any other new member of an institution, I felt responsible for repairing the damage caused by my predecessors. That is why the following morning, after phoning my friend Miguel Musumesi, who was an anthropologist at La Plata University, I took a shovel and crossed the street. Soon, a small group driven by curiosity gathered around me. The group grew larger as the minutes went by, and, perhaps out of boredom, they decided to help. At around noon, we found what looked like a stone path. We later discovered it was a pentagon. Intuitively, I dug in the center of the pentagon, but when I didn't find anything there, I remembered that the pentagon is a symbol used to keep the devil out, not in. So we kept digging and discovered that there were actually 5 pentagons, linked by the vertices. In the center of these, I found what I was looking for. I asked Miguel, who had just arrived, to retrieve the bones so that we could give them a proper Christian burial. A rather gruesome argument was brought up among the crowd. The topic was whether the remains of the unborn should be buried with the mother or they should be separated. Even more gruesome, however, was Miguel's reply. The bones were already separated. The remains of both victims were buried in separate graves the following morning in the Flores cemetery. But as soon as night covered the consecrated grounds, the tomb of the baby was desecrated. It was around 6 a.m. when a woman in shock was received at Dr. Cosme Argerich Hospital. The woman stated that she had been raped, but after examining her both physically and psychologically, the doctors concluded that she suffered from schizophrenia. 9 months later, however, the woman gave birth to a beautiful boy. It was still clear for the doctors that the woman was not fit to be a mother. In fact, she herself rejected the baby violently. And so the boy, who had been named Lucio by the nurses, was adopted by a couple of doctors whose surname was the Shorshi. Today, 30 years later, as I write these lines, I witness the outbreak of World War III. Everyone points at Lucio the Shorshi, the Argentine dictator, as the man to blame. God knows that they should in fact point at me.